Between 1945 and 1950, an estimated 43,000 to 65,000 former SS soldiers, Gestapo agents, and Nazi functionaries died in Soviet special camps, not from battlefield bullets, but from a deliberate system of starvation, disease, and forced labor designed to make survival itself the punishment. As one survivor recalled, "We were so hungry that we ate grass and roots." Every day men died in the barracks, and the stench of sickness and death was everywhere. This wasn't the quick vengeance of execution squads. This was Stalin's calculated hell, reserved specifically for Hitler's most fanatical followers. May 1945. As the guns fell silent across Europe, Stalin's war against Hitler's fanatical soldiers was just beginning. While Western allies prepared for Nuremberg trials, Soviet NKVD Chief Lavrenti Beria was implementing something far more brutal: a comprehensive system to hunt down, isolate, and systematically break every SS officer, Gestapo agent, and Nazi functionary his forces could find. This wasn't random chaos in the fog of victory. Between 1945 and 1950, Soviet forces systematically identified and interned between 120,000 and 180,000 SS members, Gestapo agents, and Nazi functionaries. Three men orchestrated this machinery of vengeance. Beria himself commanded the overall apparatus through the NKVD. Viktor Abakumov, head of SMERSH counterintelligence and later the Ministry of State Security, personally decided who went to the camps and who faced immediate execution. His signature on a document meant life or death. Ivan Serov, NKVD general stationed in Germany, oversaw the special camps where these prisoners would be ground down year after year. The Soviets were methodical in their hunting. SMERSH units conducted mass screenings across occupied territories. They used networks of informants who remembered which neighbors had worn SS uniforms. They studied captured Nazi documents, cross-referencing names and unit assignments. They conducted intensive interrogations, asking questions only real SS members could answer. SS men attempting to blend in with regular Wehrmacht soldiers found themselves exposed by tattoos revealing blood types under their arms, the mark of Hitler's elite. Concentration camp survivors identified their former tormentors. The Nazis' own meticulous records became evidence against them. The Soviets knew the difference between a conscripted farm boy and Hitler's ideological true believers. They made deliberate distinctions in their retribution. Waffen-SS members received harsher treatment than Wehrmacht soldiers. High-ranking officers faced immediate isolation. The purpose was explicit in internal Soviet directives: extract maximum forced labor for post-war reconstruction, while creating a brutal deterrent to any remaining Nazi resistance in occupied territories. High-ranking SS officers faced solitary confinement in basement cells. Interrogators worked them over for weeks. Lower-level functionaries were swept into the general system of camps. All would serve Stalin's dual agenda: rebuilding what the Wehrmacht had destroyed while their bodies slowly broke under deliberate deprivation. The machinery was now in motion. But where would it send them? The answer revealed the bitter irony at the heart of Soviet vengeance. They would suffer in the very camps they once helped create. The gates of Sachsenhausen concentration camp reopened in August 1945. But this time, former SS guards found themselves on the other side of the wire. The Soviets had transformed Hitler's concentration camps into special camps for his most fanatical followers. The hunters had become the hunted. They were imprisoned in their own instruments of terror. Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, sites where the SS had perfected the machinery of Nazi oppression, now became Soviet special camps number 1 and number 2. At peak capacity, each held between 15 and 25,000 prisoners, the very men who had once administered similar camps for Hitler's victims. The barbed wire fences remained. The guard towers still loomed over the grounds. The barracks still reeked of suffering. Only the uniforms of the guards had changed. Former SS officers walked paths they'd once patrolled. They slept in buildings where their victims had died. But the Soviets weren't interested in replicating the Nazi camp system. They were building something designed for a different purpose. These weren't extermination camps. They were grinding machines. They extracted every ounce of labor from prisoners' bodies while providing the absolute minimum to keep them alive. Just enough to work, not enough to recover. The operational philosophy was brutally simple: control, labor extraction, and punishment. Prisoner welfare never entered the equation. The infrastructure of suffering relied on deliberate deprivation. Food, clothing, and medicine were requisitioned from surrounding German territory or diverted from Soviet military stocks. Priority always went to Soviet personnel. What trickled down to prisoners fell far below subsistence levels. Overcrowded barracks offered inadequate heating, even in brutal German winters. Men huddled together for warmth. Frost formed on the inside walls. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. One latrine for hundreds of men. Disease spread like wildfire. Medical care meant watching your comrades die in the barracks because there were no doctors, no medicine, no intention to heal. Security didn't require sophisticated technology. The Soviets relied on informant networks that turned prisoner against prisoner. Men desperate for an extra piece of bread would report whispered conversations. The atmosphere of paranoia was its own form of torture. You couldn't trust anyone. The man sleeping next to you might be reporting your words to the guards. Work assignments completed the system's logic. Prisoners were forced into construction, mining, and agricultural labor to rebuild the very territories the Wehrmacht had destroyed. Their bodies literally built Soviet-occupied Europe while slowly breaking down. They hauled rubble. They dug ditches. They harvested crops they would never eat. The work demanded 3,000 calories per day. The camps provided far less. Inside these repurposed hells, the Soviets implemented a policy that would prove deadlier than battlefield combat. The deliberate withholding of basic survival necessities that turned every day into a fight against death itself. In the winter of 1946, prisoners in Buchenwald's Soviet special camp faced a grim mathematics. Their daily food ration provided roughly 1,200 calories, while forced labor demanded 3,000. The equation was simple and deliberate. Their bodies would slowly consume themselves until nothing remained but ghosts behind the wire. Estimates indicate that between 43,000 and 65,000 prisoners died in these special camps between 1945 and 1950, representing up to 1/3 of everyone the Soviets had interned. But these weren't the quick deaths of battlefield execution. This was starvation measured in months. Disease left deliberately untreated. Exposure endured through winter after winter in unheated barracks. The principal killers weren't bullets. They were hunger, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and the slow grinding down of human bodies pushed beyond their limits day after day. The camps operated under a policy of extreme resource deprivation that went far beyond neglect. Food rations were kept systematically below subsistence levels. Watery soup with a few potato peels, a slice of black bread, sometimes a spoonful of kasha. This forced prisoners into a biological nightmare where their own bodies became their final meal. Muscle tissue dissolved first, then organs began to fail. Men who had once stood as Hitler's elite soldiers now shuffled like ancient men. Their bodies were cannibalizing themselves from the inside out. Siegfried Knappe, a Wehrmacht officer who survived the system, watched this slow-motion death consume his fellow prisoners daily. We were so hungry that we ate grass and roots. Every day men died in the barracks, and the stench of sickness and death was everywhere. This was the reality inside Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, not the dramatic horror of mass executions, but the grinding monotony of watching men waste away. Their bodies shrank. Their eyes sank into their skulls. Then one morning they simply didn't wake up. Heinrich Gerlach's diary captured something even more devastating than physical death: the systematic annihilation of the human spirit. I felt myself dissolve into nothingness, a number among numbers, a ghost in the shadow of the wire. The camps destroyed minds as methodically as they destroyed bodies. identity evaporated. Your name became a number. Your past became irrelevant. Hope became a dangerous luxury that drained precious energy. Survival itself transformed into the ultimate punishment. Each day, another test of whether you could endure one more sunrise in hell, another roll call in freezing rain, another bowl of soup that was mostly water, another night listening to men cough themselves to death in the darkness. This wasn't accidental. The high mortality rate was a feature of Soviet policy, not a bug, answering vengeance not with the mercy of quick execution, but with prolonged suffering that lasted years. Yet even within this systematic hell, the Soviets made careful distinctions about who suffered most, creating a hierarchy of punishment that reserved special brutality for Hitler's most ideologically committed followers. When Ivan Serov's NKVD officers processed new arrivals at the special camps, they consulted detailed lists and conducted interrogations to determine one crucial fact. Were you Wehrmacht or Waffen-SS? The answer could mean the difference between slim chance of survival and virtually certain death. The Soviets had created a hierarchy of hell. Special brutality was reserved for Hitler's true believers. High-ranking SS officers faced the harshest fate. They were immediately isolated from other prisoners. Guards marched them to basement cells. Interrogators worked them over in sessions that lasted hours. The questions never stopped. The beatings came without warning. If identified as major war criminals, they often faced summary execution without trial. No lawyers, no appeals. Just a bullet in the back of the head and an unmarked grave. The Soviets systematically separated these men. They couldn't be allowed to organize resistance. They couldn't maintain the command structures that had once terrorized Eastern Europe. Every high-ranking SS officer is a potential threat. So they were broken individually, in isolation, where no one could hear them scream. Waffen-SS members, even those of lower rank, were deliberately treated more brutally than Wehrmacht soldiers. The Soviets made careful distinctions in their retribution. Regular army conscripts might eventually see release. But those who'd worn the double lightning bolts were marked for special punishment. They got the worst work details. They hauled the heaviest loads. They received the smallest rations. Guards who remembered what the SS had done to Soviet villages delivered the most savage beatings. The SS tattoo, blood type marked under the left arm, became a death sentence. Men tried to burn it off with heated metal. They scraped their skin raw, trying to erase it. But the scar tissue only made it more obvious. The mark of Hitler's elite had become the mark of Cain. Yet the machinery of Soviet vengeance swept up more than just the guilty. Archival records reveal a troubling reality that complicates any simple narrative of justice. Many internees were civilians, women accused of collaboration, children caught in mass denunciations, low-level bureaucrats whose only crime was working in the wrong office when the Red Army arrived. Not everyone behind the wire had committed war crimes. Some were merely accused by neighbors settling old scores. A man who'd gotten the better apartment. A woman who'd refused someone's advances. The chaos of occupation created opportunities for revenge that had nothing to do with Nazism. The NKVD didn't always investigate thoroughly. An accusation was often enough. Even escape from this carefully calibrated hell proved impossible. At Buchenwald, several former SS officers spent months digging a tunnel. They worked in shifts. They hid the dirt in their pockets and scattered it during exercise periods. They were meticulous, patient, desperate. They were caught 3 meters from freedom. The Soviets had known about the tunnel for weeks. An informant had reported the first shovel of dirt. The guards let them dig, let them hope. Then they filled the tunnel entrance with machine gun fire. They dragged out the survivors and executed them publicly in the camp yard. Every prisoner was forced to watch. The message was clear. Not even the desperate ingenuity that might have saved them in wartime could breach the wire now. This hierarchy of suffering would persist for years, until Stalin's death in 1953 finally opened the gates. But for those who survived to see freedom, the psychological scars would prove permanent. March 1953. The gates of Sachsenhausen opened one final time as Soviet authorities began mass releases following Stalin's death. The men who stumbled out barely resembled the SS officers and Nazi functionaries who had entered years earlier. They were ghosts who had survived hell. They carried scars that would never heal, stories that would remain unspoken for decades. Between 1950 and 1954, the Soviet MVD emptied most of the special camps in Germany. They released prisoners who had endured 5 to 9 years of the systematic brutality we've witnessed: the starvation rations, the forced labor, the daily deaths in overcrowded barracks. Most German special camps closed by 1950. Surviving prisoners were either freed or transferred deeper into the Soviet Union. Those who emerged carried the physical evidence of their ordeal. Bodies wasted by years of malnutrition, ribs visible through skin, teeth rotted from scurvy, minds fractured by prolonged isolation, the psychological wounds of watching comrades dissolve into nothingness behind the wire. Men in their 30s looked 70. They walked with the shuffle of the elderly. Their eyes held nothing. Yet even in this machinery of retribution, moments of humanity occasionally flickered. One former prisoner recounted how an anonymous Soviet guard quietly slipped him an extra piece of bread. The guard said simply, "Not all Germans are the same." War is over now. It was a rare acknowledgement that the war's end should have meant something different. Though for most, mercy came too late or never arrived at all. The camp's legacy extended far beyond their barbed wire. In East Germany, the memory of arbitrary arrest and mass internment shaped political culture for decades. People learned not to speak freely, not to trust neighbors, not to ask questions about family members who disappeared. The climate of fear and distrust remained taboo until communism's fall in 1989. For German families who had lived years without news of imprisoned loved ones, the trauma proved generational. Wives waited by windows for husbands who never returned. Children grew up in the shadow of fathers who came back fundamentally broken, unable to speak of what they'd endured, unable to reconnect with families who couldn't understand. The silence between them was its own kind of prison. Some men never spoke about the camps at all. They took their stories to the grave. Others waited decades before they could find words for what they'd survived. By then, their children were grown. The opportunity for understanding had passed. In the 1990s, both Russia and Germany began reviewing cases of wrongful internment. Archival research revealed what many had long suspected. The Soviet retribution machine had swept up innocents alongside the guilty. Civilians caught in denunciations, low-level functionaries with no connection to war crimes, women and children imprisoned for the crimes of relatives they barely knew. Posthumous exonerations followed. In rare cases, financial compensation for survivors or their families. Acknowledgement that the line between justice and vengeance had often blurred beyond recognition. That not everyone who suffered in Stalin's special camps had earned their punishment. That the machinery of retribution, once set in motion, consumed guilty and innocent alike. The special camps had accomplished their purpose. Not the swift justice of execution, but the slow grinding down of Hitler's fanatical soldiers through years of calculated suffering, Stalin's ultimate answer to the question of retribution. The Soviet special camps answered the question of retribution not with the swift justice of Nuremberg trials or the finality of firing squads, but with years of calculated suffering that killed 1/3 of all prisoners and psychologically destroyed those who survived. When the camps finally closed after Stalin's death and survivors emerged in the early 1950s, they were broken shells, ghosts who had dissolved into nothingness behind the wire. This was Stalin's ultimate payback, not just death, but the slow grinding down of Hitler's fanatical soldiers in a hell deliberately reserved for them, where every day of survival was another day of punishment. The machinery had done its work. The retribution was complete. But the scars on survivors, on families, on nations would never fully heal. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.